Close to 150 dial scales were seized by officers attached to the Gnbs over the weekend from vendors at Border and Stabroek markets. This was confirmed by Public Relations Officer of the Gnbs, Lloyd David. The devices were neither approved nor verified by the Bureau of Standards for commercial purposes. Do the scales that they use, in comparison with the scales you recommended, have a difference in value? Is it possible that these vendors can actually give consumers less than they're paying for?
Yes, the possibility is there because with the domestic dial scale, it has a spring mechanism inside that quickly loses its elasticity. It becomes slack. So what happens that if you go to request as a consumer, you go to request, say, a one kilogram of sugar. When a 1 kilogram of sugar is placed onto that scale, the actual reading on that scale would be like 1.5 kilogram of sugar or 1.2 or 1.3, right? So what really you'll be paying for is 1.2 or 1.3 kilogram instead of the 1 kilogram.
Public Relations Officer of the Gnbs, Lloyd David. Mr. David posited that while the campaign was deemed successful, more needs to be done, and if the Gnbs has to continue this surveillance exercise repeatedly, it will, regardless of the feelings of the vendors. I know some of the vendors would not have been too happy with their scales being seized. What was the overall response from them, and was the entity, the Bureau of Standards, did it acknowledge the concerns aired by these vendors?
Well, actually, last week's exercise was not a good one if we're going to talk about that because for a lot of vendors, they weren't too happy that we removed their scale. But we have to look at the bigger picture of things. We want to ensure that the consumers are protected. We want to ensure that the consumers get the accurate measurements. And therefore, we have to do what we have to do to remove those devices.
The PRO of Gnbs added that the current statutes do not make provision for stiff penalties, and perhaps this is why vendors repeatedly purchase new scales which are not verified or approved by the Gnbs, despite the entity seizing their scales. As such, legally, the Gnbs is tackling this issue to ensure that stronger penalties are in place. For the vendors that you've seized these scales from, are there any fines or penalties that they would have to face or bear?
Okay, at the moment, what happens is that the Ghana National Bureau of Standards, we are working to revise our Weights and Measures Act. We proposed a new metrology bill, which will address fines and penalties because, as you know, the previous act is since 1981, and the fines have become very negligible, and we need to upgrade our fines to the current situation. That's why we're revising the metrology bill, revising the metrology legislation so that persons can be prosecuted accordingly.
Reporting for HGP Nightly News, I am Kristen Macklingam.